Yep, all good.
So now we get to the end of week 1 and we start to look at the place in the middle. Where has the sustainability and biculturalism started to overlap? And hopefully as you've gone through the modules, you've been able to see some crossover of how they inform and influence one another. So we're going to give a couple of examples, but we really also want you to come up with your own examples and take notes as you go throughout the course so that you have some really good material to add into your reflective journal as part of your assessment.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yep. So Sarah, what have you sort of been thinking about from your side of the course from the sustainability angle?
Yeah. So I was starting to think about the definitions of sustainability and where they might be a little bit limited in terms of not fully including an Indigenous perspective. What would an Indigenous model look like of sustainability? And also around environmental philosophy. So I wanted to read this out a little bit. I saved it till the end so I could share it with you. So environmental philosophy examines our relation as human beings to nature or our natural environment. It reviews our philosophical understanding of nature and our conception of nature's value and entitlements. It explores how we are to live with and in nature and to what degree nature is or is not implicated in our own human identity. And I know you talk a lot about identity. We're talking about place, identity, and practice. So I'm really interested in how nature really informs your identity, because in my course we've been looking a lot at place and our connection, our feeling, our emotional connection to nature, and how that informs how we feel about it, how we relate to it, and therefore the practice of what we do about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in our whakatau when we first got together, those first words that I uttered, that karakia that talked about that meta-narrative, that whole overarching philosophy of who we are as Indigenous people within this landscape. But as we went through those layers of time and those layers of identity and what I've used the word a couple of times, whakapapa, that it tells us as people, as Indigenous people, that we are in this landscape and part of this landscape, and that's dictated by the larger conversation that we have, that meta-narrative. There was darkness and then there was light, then stuff happened and there were people and birds and fish and everything else. So that connection between all things, is that?
Yeah, and what I heard in there was that you're a part of nature, not separate from nature. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Like how are you a part of nature?
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah.
You know, is that a far off concept or is, yeah?
Well, and that's really interesting because when we do talk about that meta-narrative and as part of the conversations we've had, obviously, you know, koraki nui e tu atu nei, papa tuanuku takoto iho nei, that from our creation story, the sky is up there and the earth is down there, and here is a tree, and there is a bird, and there is a fish, and they all sit within a narrative and come out of the environment. So just as we've encouraged you to build connections and relationships between people, and we see how that all works. From my Indigenous perspective, that connection and that relationship supersedes just people, but goes into our relations that are birds and fish and trees. Now, when I'm talking about that relationship, I don't know if it's a DNA relationship or, you know, how it works, and actually a DNA could be water, could be maku, I talked about that. But we all live in this same place, we cohabitate in this same place, and there is a mutually beneficial relationship that sits between people and trees and fish. If we look after them, they'll look after us, just as we do with people. So yeah, it's definitely being a part of nature and a part of the environment. Yeah,
and that reminds me of a sustainability concept, mutualism, where we're in relationship. You know, and actually with a tree right now, it's like giving us oxygen, we're providing carbon dioxide.
It's tapping me on the shoulder.
It's tapping, that's right. And that mutualism is part of terminology of how we can understand the different relationships from a sustainability lens in nature. But I'm hearing also from an Indigenous lens, it's also just a part of how you've been raised and a part of your idea of how you fit into this place.
Yep, definitely. And if you remember those stories that I told about my place, and when you look on those field trips we went on, down to my place on the island. We are that place. You know, our people have lived there for generation after generation after generation, and that place is what it is because we've looked after it, and we are what we are because it looks after us.
Yeah. And just before you talked about how everything fits into nature, and that reminded me of the environmental models that we started to look at, and that big circle of nature, and then society fitting within that, and then the economy fitting within that, but that nature is the biggest circle, and how we might relate to that.
Yeah. And that's fascinating because when you talk about nature, the environment, about people, and about economies, it goes back to those three things that we've been talking about all the way through, about place, identity, and practice. So it looks like we're talking the same language here.
Oh wow! So there is a place in the middle.
There's a space in the middle.
Yeah, cool. So that's great. That's a great example of where we're starting to see some overlap. And actually, I think I just want to share a little bit about my story from being Pākehā, New Zealand European, because when I was being raised, this whole concept of whakapapa, or being connected or from the land, was so foreign, or it is foreign in my cultural construct. And as I have gone throughout my life and had different experiences and done a lot of work in the outdoors, I've started to build a connection. But my connection really came through knowledge and understanding and experiences, as opposed to a known sense of identity or a known sense of self that has come from my family or my upbringing. So for me, I very much feel connected and like I'm a part of nature, but it's also something that I've learned, which started intellectually, but now has dropped into an emotional sense or a bodily sense of knowing and feeling that I'm a part of nature. So I think that's perhaps where there's some differences as well of my assumption is that from an Indigenous point of view, that is an assumption, that is a known construct that is really acceptable. Whereas for me, I felt like that was something I had to learn, and that, even now, perhaps when I talk to friends or I talk to my family still don't really quite understand or quite get that that's quite a far out there concept. Yeah. And then what does that even mean? And then that's the relationship that I have to nature is different to the one you have with nature, and that's unique, and it's also can be difficult to explain sometimes if it's just a feeling or a felt sense. Yep,
definitely. And when we look at the culture of education from a Western perspective, within the education system we have, we pretty much want people, participants, learners, students, to come into a situation without any knowledge at all. That's sometimes the preferred mode of knowledge transference. You have nothing, I'll give you everything you need, trust me, I know what I'm saying, and then you'll come out knowing everything that I've told you. But for me, that knowledge transference system for Indigenous people is you have all of this stuff that comes from the places that you live in, from the people that you've interacted with, and let me just add another story onto that. So once again, it talks about that difference between an individualistic perspective of who you may be and what you may have and what you may own, to more of a collective. Actually, knowledge is all around us, and it's informed by everything we do and by every interaction that we have. So when you're out in the environment, learn from the trees, which is a crazy concept at times, but learn.
Yeah, that's right. And it reminds me of times where I've just sat in the forest or sat in the wilderness and literally just sat there, and how much wisdom that has been downloaded or given as a gift to me in that space.
Nice.
It also reminds me of, I know we've had this conversation before, so the circle model, with the economy and society and the environment. I know we've also talked about it in terms of identity, in terms of the individual in the middle, and then the society around that, and then the environment that informs that. And I know that sometimes we've come from a slightly different viewpoint of, perhaps a more Western viewpoint has been start with the individual and individual practice, because we can't change the world without changing ourselves. first, and really knowing that and knowing our identity, and then we can influence the people around us, which then influences the wider environment and our relationship to it.
Yeah.
I know sometimes you've had a different viewpoint. Is that true, or where is this?
Yep, I would definitely say it's true. And if we go back to when I introduced myself at the start of this course, and I use the construct of mountains first, and rivers, and sea, and islands, and place, and people, and families, and then the most insignificant thing in that whole story was me. I'm just a part of that larger narrative, that larger story. So, definitely the most insignificant part of that, but it's the landscape that drives the identity that informs the person.
Yeah, and that's really interesting when we get to practice, right? How do we do that? And is it about working with the individual first and their connection and their spread out? Is it about working or appreciating the environment and listening to what the environment has to say to us and being guided perhaps by something bigger than ourselves? So, and I don't think there's a yes or a no or a right or a wrong here. I think it's both. Right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. But I think that's that's a lovely statement that you've just made. There's no yes or no. There's no right or wrong. There's no sort of which approach do we take. I think the best thing that when we identify who we are as an individual within a larger framework of things, then questioning, okay, well, who is this other person that I'm dealing with? Once we sort of work out who we are within a meta-narrative and reflect on and unpack the places that we're from and who we are, then we get to ask the question of, so who is this other person that I'm dealing with? How do I actually interact with them? What's this other landscape that I'm dealing with? How do I interact with that?
Yeah. And have you had any questions in relation to sustainability?
I certainly have, yeah. I think the question for me is, how do we, when you've been talking about sustainability, the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is ecological sustainability. And that makes perfect sense. How do we look after the landscape? How do we look after our brothers, the trees and the fish, etc.? But I think also and you've talked about this a few times, that social sustainability and that community sustainability.
Yeah.
Can these two things be achieved at the same time, or are they mutually exclusive, or are they two different projects?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually going to leave you hanging, because that is such a great segue into the coming week. And week 2 is all about how do we meet people's needs. And I agree with you, sometimes there is a slant towards ecological sustainability, and that can be valid because of this appreciation of we are nothing without the environment. And it definitely does not exclude the fact that humans interact with this environment and we have a huge impact on it. So any success or practice in terms of looking after the environment also has to include and accept that humans are a part of that system. And we're going to move, systems thinking is that I am the problem and I am the solution. And therefore, how do we work together so we can work with nature in harmony with nature? Yeah. And we all know human flaws, right? Like, humans can be difficult to work with sometimes, and actually some understanding around communication and respect and trust and cooperation and understanding what you've been talking about, understanding the other perspectives is actually essential for any sustainability project to get off the ground and be successful. Wow.
So just in this conversation here and in the reflections that we're having together, it seems apparent that from your narrative, from the conversations that you've had, both recorded and in real time with our participants and with myself, of course.
Yeah.
Alongside those things that I've talked about, there is this meeting space in the middle that we can share some knowledge, that share some understanding of what sustainability is about from an individual perspective, but also from a collective perspective, that we actually live in nature.
Yeah.
And not without or outside of.
That's right. Yeah, that's true. And regardless of our philosophy, because there can be lots of different people can be on a spectrum of different philosophies of how they relate to environmental ethic. regardless of where anybody sits on that scale, the fact is we live in nature. We are reliant on nature to live. So that is a fact.
Yep.
How we choose to relate to that is our own personal construct, which is based on a lot of things, how we've been raised. What are our values? What are our values of our parents? What are the experiences that we've had in life? What country are we born in? What socioeconomic grouping are we a part of?
Yep.
What colour skin do we have? What gender are we born into?
Yeah. So regardless of that meta-narrative, there is that place in the middle that says we live in nature.
We live in nature, and it informs our identity.
Yeah. Well, looking forward to next lot of conversations the next
Right.
week. To see where we go from there, with that
Yeah.
whole idea of how do we actually converse with others, how do we share this with
Yeah.
others, and once we've established who we are,
Yes.
who are you and how does this work?
Yeah, that identity in the middle.
Yep.
What do we do with that?
Yeah. Nice. Well, it's been fun.